Within hours of Margaret Thompson's arrest at Windsor Castle, the videos of her grabbing Guardsman Robert Hayes by the throat had exploded across social media. The hashtag entitled Woman Windsor was trending worldwide, with millions of views and thousands of comments expressing outrage at her behavior. Margaret sat in the holding cell at Windsor Police Station, her designer outfit wrinkled and her perfectly styled hair disheveled. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, though she still maintained that she was the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. Her one phone call had gone to her husband, Richard, who was currently on a business trip in Singapore. "Richard, you need to get me out of here immediately," she had demanded into the phone. "These people have lost their minds. They've arrested me for simply trying to get proper customer service. I need you to call our lawyer and sort this mess out right now." Richard Thompson had built his successful investment firm by being calm under pressure and thinking several steps ahead. When his wife explained what had happened, he immediately understood that this was not a simple customer service dispute that money and connections could make disappear. His wife had physically assaulted a Queen's Guard at one of Britain's most important royal residences, and it had been captured on video for the world to see. "Margaret, please tell me you didn't actually put your hands on the guard," he said, hoping desperately that she was exaggerating. "I barely touched him. I was trying to get his attention because he was being incredibly rude and unprofessional. These people are completely overreacting to the whole situation." Richard closed his eyes and leaned back in his hotel chair. He could already imagine the phone calls he would be receiving from business partners, clients, and friends who had seen the videos. Their social standing in the community, built over decades, was about to crumble overnight. Back at Windsor Castle, Detective Inspector Sarah Williams was reviewing the evidence with her team. The case was straightforward from a legal perspective. Multiple videos clearly showed Margaret grabbing Robert's throat, constituting assault. But the high-profile nature of the incident and the international attention it was receiving meant that everything had to be handled with extra care. "The videos are crystal clear," said Detective Constable Mark Roberts, who had been analyzing the footage. She approached the guard, began shouting at him, and then grabbed him by the throat. "The assault is undeniable." Williams nodded grimly. "What's the background check on the suspect showing?" "Margaret Thompson, age 52, no previous criminal record. Wealthy businesswoman, married to Richard Thompson, who runs Thompson Investment Management. They're well-connected socially, but no significant political ties. She serves on several charity boards and has a reputation for being, let's say, demanding in her personal dealings." Meanwhile, the media attention was intensifying by the hour. News outlets around the world had picked up the story, with headlines ranging from entitled "Tourist Attacks Queen's Guard" to "Windsor Castle Chaos as Woman Assaults Guard." The incident was being discussed on talk shows, analyzed by legal experts, and debated in Parliament. Guardsman Robert Hayes had finished his shift and provided his statement to Detective Inspector Williams. His account was professional and measured, describing exactly what had occurred without editorializing about Margaret's behavior or his own feelings about the assault. "She grabbed my throat with both hands and squeezed while demanding that I acknowledge her," Robert stated. "I maintained my position and did not respond verbally or physically to the assault, as per my training and protocols." Williams studied the young guard's face. Despite his professional demeanor, she could see the strain of the experience in his eyes. "How are you feeling about what happened, Guardsman Hayes?" Robert considered the question carefully. "It was certainly not a scenario we trained for specifically, but our general protocols served well. I'm proud that I maintained my position and composure throughout the incident." What Robert didn't mention was how violated he felt by the assault, or how difficult it had been to remain motionless while being physically attacked. The incident would stay with him for a long time, though he would never let it shake his dedication to his duty. The next morning, Margaret appeared before a magistrate for her initial hearing. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters and photographers, turning what should have been a routine proceeding into a media circus. Margaret's lawyer, Jonathan Hartwell, was one of London's top criminal defense attorneys, rushed back from vacation to handle the case. "Your Honor," Hartwell addressed the magistrate, "my client deeply regrets this incident, which arose from a misunderstanding about tourist protocols. Mrs. Thompson has no prior criminal record, and is a respected member of her community who contributes significantly to charitable causes. The prosecutor, however, painted a different picture. Your Honor, this was an unprovoked assault on a member of the Queen's Guard in the execution of his duties. The defendant showed complete disregard for the guard's safety and the security protocols at one of our most important royal residences. The incident was witnessed by hundreds of tourists and has caused international embarrassment. Margaret was released on bail with conditions that included staying away from all royal properties and surrendering her passport. As she left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions at her, but Hartwell hurried her into a waiting car without comment. The video footage continued to spread across social media platforms, spawning memes, reaction videos, and endless commentary. The incident had touched a nerve about entitlement, privilege, and respect for public servants. People who had never heard of Margaret Thompson were expressing strong opinions about her behavior and calling for serious consequences. Robert's commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, visited him personally to check on his welfare. The entire regiment is proud of how you handled yourself, Hayes. That was an extraordinary test of your professionalism, and you passed with flying colors. The royal family's communication team was also dealing with the fallout. While they couldn't comment on the legal proceedings, they issued a statement supporting the Guard and emphasizing that assaulting any member of the Queen's Guard was a serious criminal offense that would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Margaret's world was collapsing around her. The charity boards she served on were quietly asking for her resignation. Friends were no longer returning her calls. The exclusive country club where she and Richard were members was reviewing their membership in light of recent events. Their social calendar, once filled with dinner parties and events, was suddenly empty. Richard returned from Singapore to find his business also under scrutiny. Several major clients had called expressing concern about their association with the firm. The partners were suggesting that perhaps Richard should take an extended leave of absence until the situation resolved itself. I don't understand how everything went so wrong so quickly, Margaret said to her husband as they sat in their now quiet mansion. I was just trying to get proper service. Why won't anyone understand that? Richard looked at his wife with a mixture of love, frustration, and disbelief. Margaret, you grabbed a soldier by the throat at Windsor Castle. There's video of it everywhere. This isn't about customer service anymore. This is about assault and public humiliation. As the weeks passed and the case moved through the legal system, Margaret's sense of entitlement slowly began to crack. Her lawyer had made it clear that pleading guilty and showing genuine remorse was her only path to avoiding jail time. The evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion was entirely against her. The day of her sentencing arrived with less media fanfare than her initial arrest, but the courtroom was still packed with reporters and curious observers. Margaret stood before the judge, finally, understanding the full consequences of those few seconds when she had grabbed Robert's throat. Mrs. Thompson, the judge said sternly, your actions that day showed a shocking disregard for the dignity and safety of a public servant carrying out his duties. Your sense of entitlement led you to assault a member of the Queen's Guard in front of hundreds of witnesses, including children. Margaret received a suspended prison sentence, a substantial fine, and was ordered to perform community service. She was also banned from visiting any royal property for 5 years. As she left the courthouse for the final time, there were no reporters waiting. The world had moved on to other stories, leaving Margaret to face the consequences of her actions in relative obscurity. Robert continued his service with the Queen's Guard, though the incident had changed him. He remained professional and dedicated, but the experience had taught him that even in the most controlled and traditional settings, human behavior could be unpredictable and shocking. He never spoke publicly about what happened, maintaining the dignity and discretion expected of his position. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale about privilege, entitlement, and the consequences of believing that rules don't apply to you. The woman who had demanded attention and respect had received both, but not in any way she could have imagined. Her moment of rage at Windsor Castle would follow her for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder that actions have consequences, regardless of who you think you are. The incident served as a powerful reminder to millions of people around the world who watched the videos. Respect for others, especially those serving the public, should never be compromised by personal frustration or a sense of entitlement. The Queen's guards continued their silent, dignified watch, and tourists continued to visit Windsor Castle, but perhaps with a better understanding of the boundaries that should never be crossed. Margaret Thompson had always believed the world owed her something special. At 52 years old, she carried herself with the air of someone who had never been told no and didn't plan to start accepting it now. Her expensive designer handbag swung from her arm as she marched through the crowds at Windsor Castle, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight. She had driven down from her mansion in the Cotswolds that Tuesday morning, expecting what she called the royal treatment. Margaret owned 3 luxury boutiques and was married to a successful investment banker. In her mind, this made her practically nobility herself. She had paid for the premium tour package and expected every door to be opened for her, every rope to be lifted, and every restriction to be waived. The Queen's guards stood at their posts like living statues, their red tunics bright against the ancient stone walls of the castle. Tourists gathered around them, snapping photos and whispering in amazement at how still the guards could remain. Children pointed and giggled, while parents reminded them to keep their distance and show respect. Margaret pushed through the crowd with little regard for the other visitors. She stepped directly in front of a family from Japan who were trying to take a photo, blocking their view completely. When the father politely asked her to move, she simply ignored him and continued adjusting her position for what she considered the perfect shot. "Excuse me, ma'am, you need to step back behind the rope," said a castle security officer, approaching Margaret with a professional but firm tone. Margaret turned and looked at the young man as if he had just spoken to her in a foreign language. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, her voice rising above the general chatter of the crowd. The security officer, James Mitchell, had been working at Windsor Castle for 3 years. He had dealt with difficult visitors before, but something about Margaret's tone immediately put him on edge. "Ma'am, regardless of who you are, all visitors need to follow the same safety guidelines. Please step back behind the barrier." Margaret's face began to flush red. She was not used to being treated like a common tourist. In her world, rules were suggestions that could be bent or broken with the right connections or the right amount of money. She had donated thousands to various charities that had royal patronage. Surely that counted for something here. "I paid good money for this tour," she snapped, waving her ticket in the air like a flag of war. "I demand to speak to someone in charge. This is absolutely unacceptable treatment for someone of my standing in the community." Other tourists began to notice the commotion. Some moved away, uncomfortable with the rising tension, while others discreetly pulled out their phones. In today's world, dramatic public confrontations had a way of ending up on social media within minutes. James remained calm and professional. "Ma'am, I understand you're disappointed, but these safety barriers are in place for everyone's protection, including yours and the guards. If you'd like to speak to a supervisor, I can arrange that. But first you need to step back to the designated area." Margaret looked around at the other tourists, all of whom were obediently staying behind the ropes. The sight of them following rules that apparently didn't apply to her only made her angrier. She was Margaret Thompson. She sat on the board of directors for 2 major charities. She had met members of Parliament at dinner parties. She was not going to be lumped in with these ordinary people. The Queen's guard standing nearest to the commotion was Guardsman Robert Hayes, a 24-year-old who had been serving for 2 years. He had trained extensively for this role, learning not just the military precision required, but also the mental discipline needed to remain motionless and focused regardless of what happened around him. He had stood through thunderstorms, heat waves, and countless tourists trying to get his attention. Nothing was supposed to break his concentration. Robert could hear the argument escalating behind him, but his training kept him facing forward, his expression unchanged. The bearskin hat on his head felt heavier in the growing tension, but he remained perfectly still, rifle held at the proper angle, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the crowd. Margaret's voice grew louder and more shrill. "This is discrimination. I'm being treated differently because I'm a successful businesswoman. You people clearly don't understand who you're dealing with. My husband plays golf with people who could have your job." James signaled discreetly to another security officer across the courtyard. These situations could escalate quickly, and He wanted backup nearby. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step behind the barrier. If you continue to refuse, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. The word leave hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had never been asked to leave anywhere in her entire life. Country clubs welcomed her with open arms. Restaurants saved her the best tables. Shop owners personally attended to her needs. The idea that she could be asked to leave a place she had paid to visit was beyond her comprehension. "You cannot make me leave," she declared, her voice now loud enough that tourists 50 feet away could hear every word. "I have every right to be here. I've done nothing wrong except expect the level of service that someone of my caliber deserves." A group of American tourists nearby began filming openly now, no longer trying to hide their phones. The scene was becoming a spectacle, and Margaret was too angry to notice or care that she was becoming the star of what would likely be dozens of social media posts before the day was over. Robert continued to stand perfectly still, but, inside his mind, he was tracking every word of the argument. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but dealing with an increasingly aggressive member of the public in such close proximity was testing his focus in ways he hadn't experienced before. Margaret suddenly turned her attention to the guard himself. She had noticed how still he stood, how he seemed to ignore everything happening around him. In her twisted logic, this became another example of disrespect. Here was someone who was supposed to be serving the crown, and, by extension, serving people like her, and he was completely ignoring her presence. "And you," she shouted directly at Robert, moving closer to his position. "Are you going to stand there like a statue while I'm being mistreated? Don't you have any sense of duty to protect citizens from harassment?" James stepped forward quickly. "Ma'am, the guards are not permitted to break their stance or engage with visitors. Please direct your concerns to me or my supervisor." But Margaret was beyond listening to reason. The combination of her lifelong entitlement, her anger at being treated like everyone else, and the public nature of her humiliation had created a perfect storm of rage. She looked at Robert's perfectly still face and saw what she interpreted as smugness and disrespect. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she screamed at the guard. "I am a tax-paying citizen, and you work for me. The least you can do is acknowledge my presence." The crowd around them had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through the castle grounds. Tourists were now openly recording, some narrating the scene for their social media followers. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, and Margaret was too consumed with her own outrage to realize she was making a spectacle of herself. Robert's training was being pushed to its absolute limit. Never in his preparation had he imagined dealing with someone who would scream directly at him from just a few feet away. Every instinct told him to respond, to defend himself, to at least acknowledge the person addressing him. But his duty was clear: remain still, remain focused, remain professional no matter what. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Margaret becoming increasingly frustrated by Robert's refusal to respond to her. To her, his silence was the ultimate insult. She had never in her life been so completely ignored by someone she considered to be beneath her social station. Security reinforcements were arriving now, but Margaret was too far gone in her rage to notice. She was about to cross a line that would change everything and turn a simple disagreement about tourist guidelines into an international incident that would be replayed millions of times across the globe. The moment Margaret Thompson's manicured fingers wrapped around Guardsman Robert Hayes's throat, time seemed to freeze at Windsor Castle. The collective gasp from the crowd created an eerie silence that lasted only a heartbeat before absolute chaos erupted across the ancient courtyard. Robert felt the pressure of Margaret's grip against his collar and the base of his throat. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to react, to defend himself, to push this woman away. But even in this unprecedented situation, his training held firm. He remained motionless, though his eyes flickered with surprise, and his breathing became slightly more labored under her grip. Margaret's face was twisted with rage as she held onto the guard's throat. "Now will you listen to me?" she snarled, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtyard. "I am not someone you can ignore. I demand the respect I deserve." The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Children began crying as their parents pulled them back, creating a ripple effect of movement as people either fled the scene or pressed closer to get a better view. Phone cameras that had been recording the argument were now capturing what would become one of the most shocking tourist incidents in Windsor Castle's modern history. James Mitchell, the security officer, moved forward instantly. "Ma'am, release the guard immediately. You are assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard." His professional composure cracked for the first time, his voice sharp with urgency and disbelief. Other tourists in the crowd began shouting as well. A retired military veteran from Scotland yelled, "That's assault on a serviceman," while a mother from Birmingham screamed, "Someone stop her." The peaceful atmosphere of the historic castle had been shattered completely. Margaret seemed oblivious to the chaos she had created. In her mind, she had finally gotten the attention she deserved. The guard was no longer ignoring her. Everyone was looking at her. This was how things should be when Margaret Thompson visited places of importance. But Robert's continued silence, even with her hands around his throat, only fueled her anger further. She tightened her grip slightly and leaned closer to his face. "Say something," she demanded. "Acknowledge me. I am not invisible." Additional security personnel were running across the courtyard now, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The incident was being reported up the chain of command at lightning speed. An assault on a Queen's Guard at Windsor Castle was not just a criminal matter. It was a potential national security issue that would require immediate and decisive action. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams was in the castle's security office reviewing routine reports when the call came through. She had worked royal protection for 8 years and had seen many unusual incidents, but nothing quite like this. Within seconds, she was running toward the courtyard, her mind racing through protocols for such an unprecedented situation. Margaret's grip on Robert's throat loosened slightly as she suddenly became aware of the massive crowd that had gathered around them. For the first time since the confrontation began, she noticed the phones pointed at her, the shocked faces, the children hiding behind their parents. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but her pride wouldn't let her back down now. "This guard has been disrespectful to me," she announced loudly to the crowd, as if addressing a jury. "I paid good money to visit this place, and I expect proper treatment. This young man has completely ignored me, and that is unacceptable behavior from a public servant." An elderly gentleman from Wales stepped forward from the crowd. "Ma'am, you cannot put your hands on the guard. This is completely inappropriate." His voice shook with indignation and disbelief. Margaret whirled around to face him, finally releasing her hold on Robert's throat. "Who asked for your opinion? This is between me and this rude guard who thinks he's too good to acknowledge a paying visitor." Robert remained perfectly still, but those close enough could see his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the enormous effort required to maintain his composure after being physically assaulted. His throat felt sore where Margaret's fingers had pressed, and he was acutely aware of the cameras recording every second of his response to this unprecedented situation. James Mitchell reached them first, with 3 other security officers close behind. "Ma'am, I am placing you under arrest for assault," he announced, his voice clear and authoritative. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say may be given in evidence." The word arrest hit Margaret like a cold shock. She stared at James as if he had just told her the sky was green. "Arrest? You cannot arrest me. Do you have any idea who I am? My husband will hear about this. I know people in very high places." But the security team was already moving with practiced efficiency. 2 officers positioned themselves on either side of Margaret while James continued reading her rights. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as this well-dressed woman who had seemed so confident and entitled just moments before began to realize the magnitude of what she had done. "This is a mistake," Margaret protested loudly as the officers prepared to escort her away. "I was defending myself against discrimination. This guard was being deliberately rude and dismissive. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge here." Detective Inspector Williams arrived at the scene just as Margaret was being taken into custody. She quickly assessed the situation, noting the guard's continued professional stance despite what he had just endured, the crowd of shocked tourists, and the numerous phones that had undoubtedly recorded every moment of the incident. "I need everyone to step back, please," Williams announced to the crowd. "This area needs to be cleared while we conduct our investigation." She turned to James Mitchell. Give me a full account of everything that happened. And I need copies of any recordings that tourists are willing to share. Margaret was still protesting loudly as she was led away. This is absolutely outrageous. I am a respected member of my community. I serve on charity boards. My husband knows members of parliament. You people have no idea what kind of trouble you're in for treating me this way. An American tourist who had been filming the entire incident approached Detective Inspector Williams. Officer, I recorded the whole thing. Do you want me to send it to you? Within minutes, Williams had contact information for over a dozen witnesses who had captured various angles of the assault. Robert continued to stand at his post, following protocol even after such an extraordinary experience. His fellow guards at other positions around the courtyard had maintained their own stances throughout the incident, though the tension was visible in their rigid postures. This was a test of their training that none of them had ever anticipated facing. As Margaret was escorted toward the castle's security office, her protests echoed off the ancient stone walls. I want to call my lawyer. I want to speak to the castle manager. This is discrimination against successful people. You're all going to lose your jobs when my husband finds out about this. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the excited chatter and discussion would continue for hours. Tourists were already uploading their videos to social media platforms, and the incident was beginning to spread across the internet at viral speed. Within the hour, the hashtag Windsor Castle incident was trending on Twitter. Detective Inspector Williams approached Robert, who was still maintaining his position. She spoke quietly so only he could hear. Guardsman, you handled that with remarkable professionalism. When your shift ends, I'll need to take your statement about what occurred. Robert gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but enough to acknowledge her words. His throat still ached where Margaret had grabbed him, but his relief at having maintained his composure throughout the ordeal was immense. His training had held, even under the most unusual and challenging circumstances imaginable. The incident had lasted less than 10 minutes from start to finish, but its impact would ripple outward for days and weeks to come. Margaret Thompson had achieved the attention she demanded, but not in any way she could have possibly imagined. The consequences of those few seconds when she grabbed a queen's guard by the throat were only just beginning to unfold.